Welcome to the Independent Review, a weekly podcast where we bring you the latest from the world of independent journalism.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Independent Review. Today we will dive into more updates on Thacker Pass. We will then get to some foreign policy with Vanessa Beeley, a clip from James Corbett discussing Ukraine and Russia from 2015 as it relates to today, and a clip from Grand Theft World with Maddie Bannon. Let's get to it.
But today we want to at least touch on the big news that's happened in the last couple of weeks. There were two major events. Well, really three. The first was that Lithium Americas, which is the parent company of Lithium Nevada, announced that they have signed an agreement with General Motors, the largest car company in North America. The deal is basically General Motors is going to provide $650 million in funding to Lithium Americas, specifically for Thacker Pass. And in return, they're going to receive exclusive rights to buy the lithium that is produced from Thacker Pass if the mine is built. We don't mean to allow that to happen. But I'm curious, Will, what were your thoughts when you first saw that this deal was announced and as it started to go through?
Well, I think the connection with the General Motors Corporation should illustrate, what's really going on with this mine. Despite the Lithium Nevada Corporation trying to build this mine as somehow green and environmentally friendly, they're partnering with one of the most environmentally destructive corporations the planet has ever seen, the General Motors Corporation. And I just think it's a great connection for people to make to understand that while General Motors needs to buy lithium from the Thacker Pass lithium mine project site, they also have to be involved in things like steel manufacturing, plastic manufacturing, glass manufacturing, in order to create their electric cars. So this lithium supply chain is only one of the supply chains that is necessary for car manufacturing, whether we're talking about traditional fossil fuel-based cars or electric cars. So I think the fact that General Motors and Lithium Nevada and Lithium Americas are joining forces should show us that this is not about saving the planet. This is about making money. And the General Motors Corporation has made a lot of money destroying large parts of the United States and the world. And I think that connection should be here to people who are following along and who care about the natural world.
I'm looking right now at a tweet that Lithium Americas put out there on Thursday, the 16th. I'm sharing it right here. It's a photo of the electric Hummer, which is really interesting to me in particular because I came of age and grew up and started to become more politically aware in the early 2000s, late 90s, the era when the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan took place. And those of us who were following the news closely at the time understood that it was happening under false pretenses, largely to secure access to oil. And at that time, the Hummer became a symbol of conspicuous consumption, of an almost uniquely American drive in the culture for this marriage of power, conspicuous consumption, and military force. Those two things go together so well. And to me, the Hummer is such an emblem of an American car culture that is profoundly destructive to the planet. So the fact that here we have Lithium Americas promoting an electric Hummer on their platform and speaking out about this as if it's a good thing, as if this is going to help save the planet. There was just a report, interestingly, that came out in the past week or two, we were discussing it in Protect Thacker Pass among ourselves, that talked about how with the current electric utility grid in the United States, which is powered largely by natural gas, coal, hydropower, nuclear, smaller percentage of solar and wind, an electric Hummer, because it is such a large vehicle, these are, I believe, something like twice the weight of a traditional Hummer because they require such a large battery to accelerate a vehicle like that from 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3 seconds. That they're so heavy, they require so much energy to charge that this electric Hummer, actually produces more carbon emissions than a regular gasoline-powered sedan. That is so emblematic of what we have been talking about from the very beginning of this campaign in terms of the problems with this whole idea of electric vehicles, that they can save us from global warming. This myth is being exemplified right here. It's being put up front and center by Lithium Americas, and they're almost rubbing people's faces in it, saying that they want to turn this place that you see behind me in this photograph, Thacker Pass, this beautiful, incredible, spectacular, sacred, important place. They want to blow it up, destroy it, render it down into dust, literally into powder, and then turn that into batteries for that vehicle right there, the electric Hummer. It is a slap in the face, to anyone who cares about Thacker Pass, to anyone who cares about sustainability, about justice, about climate change, about sacred places, about indigenous rights and democracy. It is an affront to all of us. So, as you can tell, I get pissed when I start talking about it immediately. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should all get pissed. I think, it's like like you're saying about Thacker Pass, it's not just Thacker Pass. You have to think of all the dozens of places like Thacker Pass that will be destroyed to create those Hummers too. I mean, we're talking about Appalachia and mountaintop coal removal, or mountaintop removal for coal. That is involved in again, things like steel manufacturing. You have to talk about all of the wastes that are produced from those things, the waste that, there's been big stories about problems with the Ohio River. All of that goes into the Mississippi River. We know that they call the lower Mississippi Cancer Alley. And all of that is from things like car manufacturing, steel production, plastic production, all of which go into these cars. So they're not just destroying Thacker Pass, which is a beautiful place, but they're destroying dozens of other beautiful places around the world to get the materials that they need to make these products. And It's absolutely something that we should all be angry about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's something that we've also tried to highlight from the beginning of this campaign, is that Thacker Pass is particularly important to us, right? Because we've been fighting for it, because we've fallen in love with this place. It's particularly important to the communities who rely on it for water, to the people who go there to hunt and gather medicines, to the indigenous people who go there to learn about their history and the history of the massacres, right? And some of the things that we've learned about over the last 2 years that have come out into the public view about the cultural importance of the place. And at the same time, Thacker Pass is just one part of these global supply chains. This is something that I think is very important when we start to think about alternatives. Just yesterday, I had somebody send me a question about whether hemp batteries could be a solution. And my response to that is that I don't think they can, because the problem is not just the lithium. So if you replace the lithium with hemp, you still have the other components of the battery. You still probably need some sort of other minerals like copper or nickel. Look into those mining processes. They're just as destructive. You still need the car itself, all the other components that go into the car, from the rubber, the artificial rubber that's made from fossil fuels in the tires, to all the plastics in the interior of a car. the composites that go into the bodies of vehicles, the steel and so on. Then you have the broader social implications of building a society that's based on cars. You have the need for freeways, the need for parking lots. You have urban sprawl and increasing suburbanization as you build an increasingly car-dependent society. There are all these other effects downstream. So I think we need to be sure we're thinking about these issues deeply, and not just saying lithium is the problem, but going beyond. So I mentioned earlier that there were 3 big events that happened. That was the first one, General Motors signing this agreement with Lithium Americas, which I'm convinced that they will come to regret, because we're not going to stop. We're not going to give up on this fight. And I know that's true of everyone who's watching, everyone who's supported this campaign. I've seen an incredible amount of determination from the local communities, from the tribes, from the environmentalists, from you, Will, and I see it in myself. We're not going to stop fighting for this place until it's protected forever. The second major event that took place recently was the end of the original lawsuits that were filed against the Thacker Pass project. So, Will, could you explain what those original lawsuits were, what they weren't, and what happened last Monday? It was last Monday, right? Almost 2 weeks ago now.
Yeah. Tomorrow will be 2 weeks, I believe. So I think the first thing is just to understand what the decision in that case actually was. The judge ruled against all of the plaintiffs on all of our arguments except for one. And that was an argument that was advanced primarily by the environmental plaintiffs in the lawsuit. What the issue was, what the judge had a problem with, is that for the Thacker Pass lithium mine project, there is an area, I think it's about 1,300 acres as part of the project plan, that Lithium Nevada wants to bury under the waste rock that the open pit would result in. So when they're, creating the open pit, they're going to have all this waste rock. That waste rock has got to go somewhere. And that somewhere is this 1,300 acre area within Thacker Pass. It looks like, a prerequisite to being able to use what's called the 1872 General Mining Law, and gaining the sorts of right to mine that the General Mining Law provides people who make valid mineral claims on public lands, is exactly what I just said. If you're going to gain the rights under that 1872 mining law, you have to locate valuable minerals and verify that you've actually found valuable minerals on the land that you want to destroy for your mine. So in this case, the Bureau of Land Management, the government agency responsible for permitting the mine, did not verify whether Lithium Nevada actually had valid mineral claims for that 1,300 acres. This seems to be a strategy that federal agencies are taking. The regulations are often written in a way that make it ambiguous about what the agency's responsibilities are for actually validating these claims. So oftentimes what federal agencies are doing is they're just taking the corporation's word for it. And if a corporation tells them they've located valid minerals, then the agencies are just saying, well, okay, we have no responsibility to actually verify that. We're going to take that. We're going to take your word for it and grant you permits like the Thacker Pass lithium mine permit. So what the judge in this case did was she said, no, you do actually have to locate valuable minerals under the waste rock pile. So she is letting the rest of the 18,000 acre Thacker Pass lithium mine project go forward, but she will not let them bury that 1,300 acres under waste rock until BLM actually verifies whether there is valuable minerals and whether Lithium Nevada has actually located valuable minerals under that land that they want to put the waste rock pile on.
What does this mean? How do you translate this for the average person who's watching, who's not a lawyer, doesn't know anything about environmental permitting and mining permitting in this country? What was the outcome of that lawsuit?
Basically that the mine can go forward. All of the mine can go forward except for work on that 1,300 acres. I would imagine, I don't know exactly what the specific construction steps Lithium Nevada plans to follow to construct the mine. But given that the waste rock pile would be needed primarily once the open pit was actually being dug and lithium was started to be extracted from Thacker Pass, I think that's probably several years down the road before they would be getting to that point. So they'd be allowed to do all kinds of other sort of ancillary or supportive construction, building different facilities that they would need, digging new roads, digging new, test pits and wells and those kinds of things. It
sounds like it's a defeat. That lawsuit was a defeat for our side, for those of us who are opposing the mine.
Yes, I would think so. I should just say a resounding yes. For me personally, I represented the Reno Sparks Indian Colony in this last lawsuit. The Reno Sparks Indian Colony lost all of the arguments. I guess that's sort of a tricky way to say it. Really, the judge in this case was only considering one argument from the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, and that argument was whether or not the Bureau of Land Management violated the law when it chose not to notify the Reno Sparks Indian Colony about the Thacker Pass project. That was the only decision that she made, and the only arguments that she would consider. So, in American administrative law, which is what you call broadly this kind of law, so much the law is written in such a way that judges can only overturn an agency's decision if that decision is arbitrary or capricious, is the terms. And the documentation that the judge considers the evidence, if we were in like a criminal trial or something, the evidence that the judge reviews is only the documentation that the agency had in front of them when they made the decision to issue the permit. So in this last case, the judge was not considering any information that BLM received after the Thacker Pass record of decision was issued on January 15th, 2021. There's been a lot of stuff happen in the last 2 years, and a lot more new violations of the law from our perspective that simply were not reviewed in this last case. The Reno Sparks Indian Colony lost, and given that the project can go forward on everything but that small part of the project, I think it was a sound defeat.
So I know that sounds bad for people. We're going to transition next to talk about what just happened on Thursday, the 3 tribes filing a new lawsuit against the Thacker Pass lithium mine, which seems to be promising. I also want to ask you about appeals, whether appeals are possible for the previous case, whether that's being pursued by any of the parties. But before I do so, for those who are watching the stream, for those who have just joined us, my name is Max Wilbert. I'm the co-founder of Protect Thacker Pass. I'm here with Will Falk, the other co-founder of that organization. Will's an attorney. He has represented the Reno Sparks Indian Colony in a previous lawsuit over this Thacker Pass lithium mine issue. And he's representing Reno Sparks as well as the Summit Lake Paiute tribe in the new lawsuit that was just filed this past Thursday. We have been fighting this mine, fighting to protect Thacker Pass, this land that you see behind me in this photograph, for over 2 years now, dedicating ourselves to this fight. I hope I don't embarrass Will too much by saying that he has been doing this work pro bono as a lawyer. He has done work that's probably worth hundreds of thousands of dollars if he were being paid for it, and he hasn't charged the tribes a penny. And he has done that while running down his life savings, basically living in a basement that he got for free from a friend and a family member to make this work. So if folks want to support this fight, there are a lot of ways to get involved. Go to protectthackerpass.org. You can donate to support this, despite the fact that Will's doing this work for free. Not all lawyers do that. There are a lot of legal costs associated with a lawsuit like this, with a campaign like this. It costs thousands and thousands of dollars to make this work happen and continue. And while Lithium Americas has a budget of, they just got $330 million from General Motors the other day, we're working on literally a fraction of a penny of that. Less than 1% of 1% of that budget is what we're working with. So if you can donate, kick us $10, $5, 500, whatever you can do, it all makes a difference. And it is being used well in this fight. This money is not being squandered. It's not going to pay for a fancy office. I'm doing this live stream right now from a good friend of mine's son's bedroom, who I'm visiting. Will is again staying with a close friend of ours and getting a room for free because he can't afford rent in an expensive city. He can't afford rent anywhere else. He's trying to focus on this work 100%. And I'm just trying to be real about this. So we're not driving fancy cars, buying nice clothes, or making out like bandits in this. We're trying to focus on protecting this land. And the donations go directly to that. It's to fund the legal work, to help support this media outreach, to make it possible for us to print materials, to make videos, to get this story out there, and to keep going. So the link to the fundraiser should be down in the chat below. So any donations are very much appreciated. We're also going to be taking some questions here shortly. So keep those questions coming in the chat on Facebook, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. But the good news that I want to talk about is, well, first, Will, let's talk about the appeal just very briefly. Is there an appeal possible on this previous court case? And is that being pursued by the tribes or any of the parties?
An appeal, yeah, is still possible. There still could be an appeal. I'm not sure exactly what everyone's plans in the case are, but an appeal is possible.
Okay. So then, as far as the new lawsuit, so this past Thursday in the late evening, I know you all were working really hard trying to get this in. And I believe it was filed around 8 p.m. after probably a 10 or 12-hour day of working on it, putting the final touches on this lawsuit. 3 tribes filed an entirely new lawsuit against the federal government over this Thacker Pass lithium mine. So, Will, who are those tribes? I know that you're representing 2 of those tribes, but also they have their own spokespeople, their own voices, and I don't want to presume to speak on their behalf. Certainly not when they have incredible spokespeople like Chairman Melendez, like Michonne Eben, the TIPO from Tribal Historic Preservation Officer from Reno Sparks, like Diane Tiemann from the Burns Paiute tribe, like Chairwoman Lone Eagle from the Summit Lake Paiute tribe. These very powerful, passionate, well-spoken, talented individuals who have been so stalwart in this fight. Can you tell us a little bit about this lawsuit and what has been happening, what happened on Thursday, and what is likely to play out over the coming weeks and months?
Yeah. First, I represent the Reno Sparks Indian Colony and the Summit Lake Paiute tribe in this new lawsuit. We've joined forces with the Burns Paiute tribe. So three regional tribes here that all attach religious and cultural significance to Thacker Pass. So the basis of the new lawsuit, first and foremost, it deals primarily with what's called a post-review discovery process. Once the Reno Sparks Indian Colony and other tribes were notified about the Thacker Pass project months after the Thacker Pass permit was actually issued, they notified Bureau of Land Management that they consider all of the Thacker Pass area what's called a traditional cultural property. And there's certain consultation obligations that federal agencies have to fulfill if they're going to destroy traditional cultural property. So I want to be very clear there. Just because, and I think people should be outraged by this, but most people don't understand this. There's not a law that says that just because Native American tribes consider an area sacred, if it's on public lands and if there are valid minerals located there, the position of the government is that they have to give the mining permit to destroy that place. There's not a law that we can invoke that says, oh, this is the most sacred place in the world to, say, Paiute people. And because it's the most sacred place in the world, you can't put your mine here. That's not the law. It just says that because it's the most sacred place in the world to us, you have to consult with us about it. You have to talk to us about why it's important and things you could do to maybe avoid, harming it, or what they call mitigation, coming up with ways to soften the effect of the destruction. I don't want people to misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Thacker Pass is the most sacred place in the world to Paiute people. I'm just using that as an example. Because this is the traditional cultural property of the three tribes in this lawsuit, BLM was obligated to do more to consult about this project. But they were also obligated to do more to research what was there in Thacker Pass. So in July of 2021, the tribes presented the tribes pointed the Bureau of Land Management to the Bureau of Land Management's own records of the September 12th, 1865 massacre, which occurred in Thacker Pass. So the Bureau of Land Management houses this body of documents called the General Land Office records. And those are some of the first records that they're supposed to check when they're starting a project like this. And if they would have done that,
looking for just stuff like this, right?
Exactly. Stuff like this. Yes. They possessed those records. They either didn't find them or they did find them and figured it'd be best not to share these with the public. So the tribes in July, or maybe it was August of 2021, presented BLM or pointed out that these records existed. And eventually, a few months later, the Bureau of Land Management realized that it had to initiate this post-review discovery process. So under the National Historic Preservation Act, which is just the name of the main law at play here, if you have already permitted a project, construction hasn't started yet, which construction under the Thacker Pass record of decision has not started yet in Thacker Pass. If that construction hasn't happened, the law requires the agency to basically afford the consultation to the tribes that they would have gotten before the permit, what they would have been entitled to before the permit was issued. So BLM did say, okay, we recognize that this massacre site is in the project area, so we will initiate this post-review discovery process. But the tribes have explained that they believe that the 1865 massacre site, not to mention the whole Thacker Pass, what they're calling a traditional cultural district, extends across Thacker Pass, and that encompasses the whole Thacker Pass project area. So the tribes have explained this to BLM. BLM, without acknowledging the tribe's expertise in this analysis, has decided that they're only going to recognize a small little, I think it's about 100-acre sort of postage stamp of land as being the massacre site, and this massacre site is just on private land, and because it's conveniently on private land, BLM claims that it can't do anything to mitigate harm to the massacre site, so it doesn't have to do anything else with that massacre site. This is outrageous because so many tribes have explained to BLM that, you know, the massacre site is more than just where the people went to sleep the night that they were murdered. The historical documents describe a running battle. The soldiers' accounts of what happened describe things like caches of food that were buried around the area. When we look at how government agencies deal with other massacre sites, the Sand Creek massacre site in Colorado, for example, where hundreds of Native Americans were massacred by the U.S. cavalry in 1864, the recognition, the Bureau of Land Management's recognition of that site started in a similar way. It only wanted to recognize a very small area as the massacre site. But through the hard work of a lot of grassroots folk, that massacre site is, I think it's around 50,000 acres is recognized because Congress actually designated, by listening to testimony and oral history about what happened during the Sand Creek massacre, they expanded the landmass to include things like the approach the soldiers took, the place where the soldiers themselves were camped the night before the massacre, the escape routes of any survivors, the different there were horse herd that the people there had gathered, and they consider all of that to be the massacre site. So a big part of this new lawsuit is that BLM is just ignoring this information and not engaging with the tribes about the entire extent of the 1865 massacre site. There is one more wrinkle to this, which is we found out in September that Lithium Nevada had gained approvals from the Bureau of Land Management to begin work on these old permits that Lithium Nevada possessed in the Thacker Pass area. And these were permits that Lithium Nevada explained in what's called the Mine Plan of Operations, which is sort of the document that governs what the corporation is allowed to do once they get the permit. And within the terms and conditions of that Mine Plan of Operations, they specifically said they were going to terminate these older permits. So the Thacker Pass record of decision was issued on January 15th, 2021 by the terms and conditions of the plan of operations. Those permits were supposed to have been terminated. So when we found out in September, just last year, 2022, 5 months ago, that those permits were now being resurrected, we've had to scramble to try and tell BLM that, the work being done under those old permits is affecting the massacre site. So BLM hasn't stopped Lithium Nevada from doing that, and has in fact approved more and more work under those old permits, expanded the scope of those old permits, and is allowing Lithium Nevada to destroy my clients' traditional cultural properties without finishing the very consultation process that BLM said the tribes would get. So that is the basis and the main gist of the new lawsuit.
Okay. Thank you very much, Will. And the new lawsuit also sees the Summit Lake Paiute tribe join in to the tribes who had previously been involved in litigation, the Reno Sparks Indian Colony and the Burns Paiute tribe. I know that's significant because the BLM stated in their permit, in their decision on Thacker Pass that they released in early 2021, they said that they consulted with the Summit Lake Paiute tribe. The Summit Lake Paiute tribe says that did not happen. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's an important part of this too. In all of the what are called the National Environmental Policy Act documents, the documents that BLM shows the public, that kind of puts the public on notice about what's going on. Documents like the Environmental Impact Statement, which is sort of the main document that records just, what is going to be destroyed by projects like these. But in those documents, BLM said that it had been consulting with the Fort McDermott tribe, the Winnemucca Indian Colony, and the Summit Lake Paiute tribes 2017. It also, maybe even worse, it represented to other government agencies that it needed specific concurrences from, it needed specific agreements from these government agencies that they had in fact followed the process and the procedures. So for example, BLM told the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office, which is one of those government agencies that they were legally required to gain concurrence from, told the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office that tribal consultation with those three tribes was ongoing and that it had begun in 2017. Well,
so they lied.
They lied. And we know in April of 2021, when those three tribes finally received the letters from BLM, and all three of these tribes, upon receiving a letter from BLM about the January 15th, 2021 record of decision being issued, all three of these tribes were like, what the heck? Like, this is the first we're hearing of this project. And all those tribes wrote letters BLM saying, you never consulted with us since 2017 or ever about this project. That was not, those letters were very specifically excluded from the last case because they were letters sent after the record of decision was issued, and because none of those three tribes were actually a part of that lawsuit. So now the Summit Lake Paiute tribe is a party to this new lawsuit, and we're going to be proving that BLM did not consult with the Summit Lake Paiute tribe or the other two tribes for that matter, and misrepresented that it had to these other agencies in order to get the checkoffs that they needed. I think this I imagine or I can predict that government agencies are doing this, taking advantage of sort of ambiguous language to misrepresent the extent of things like tribal consultation. And I think we should all be, really concerned that government agencies often say that they engage in tribal consultation when they never have. So that'll be a big part of this case too.
Lies, collusion, misleading, misdirection, cooperation with the corporation to destroy these lands at the expense of the public, the tribes, the wildlife, the local communities, the water. It's the same story we've heard in a lot of different places before. It's really nothing different. The only thing different here is that this is a lithium mine. This is supposedly the new green extraction, the new green material that's going to power all the electric vehicles that are going to save us from global warming. That's what they say. So thanks for the update, Will. The final question I have for you about the lawsuit, and then we'll dive into some of these questions here and start to wrap up, is what are the next steps here? What are the best case and worst case scenarios over the coming weeks and months? Because I know that, for example, that tweet that I shared earlier from Lithium America said construction is quote unquote imminent at Thacker Pass. So we know from their own words that they are planning to go to Thacker Pass with heavy equipment, machinery, bulldozers, explosives, all the rest, and begin destroying the place in earnest very soon. I mean, it could be it could be starting today. I would probably have gotten word about it if it was. They could be starting tomorrow. They could be starting Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, next week. So this is urgent in some senses. How could things play out in terms of this legal fight and the overall campaign over the coming weeks? If you could just summarize that briefly for people who don't have any legal expertise and don't understand all the basics, but in terms of the land itself and what the land is facing over coming weeks and months, what do you see? What's the best case? What's the worst case?
Well, I guess what's the reality right now? There's nothing, there's no legal obstacle in front of Lithium Nevada that would stop them from beginning construction on the Thacker Pass mine. There's also there's no legal obstacle in front of Lithium Nevada for continuing construction on these old permits.
And let me just clarify that for everyone watching. So as a lawyer, you're saying that this new lawsuit doesn't automatically mean you have to stop construction. You can't destroy Thacker Pass until the lawsuit is completed. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and that's always the case in law. Just because somebody files a lawsuit, that doesn't mean that things just stop. There are mechanisms you can gain something like what's called a preliminary injunction, which is just a court order to hold things at the step to not allow construction to happen. But just because a lawsuit is filed, that does not mean that construction just stops. So yeah, right now there's just because we filed a lawsuit, that does not mean that Lithium Nevada, from a legal perspective, legally, it is not illegal for Lithium Nevada to start constructing out there.
So worst case scenario, it sounds like you're saying they could show up tomorrow and start destroying Thacker Pass pretty much full scale, more or less, right? And so what's the best case scenario legally? What could this lawsuit achieve? Could this put a kibosh on the whole project and stop it completely forever, or what?
So again, for cases involving mining on public land, the best that the legal process, and I'll clarify this in a second, that the legal process. So if, for example, we won this new lawsuit, what the judge would do, like a win, a full-on victory, would be the judge vacating the Thacker Pass record of decision, the permit that they have right now. So undoing that permit, which would that would mean Lithium Nevada no longer has the authority to proceed under the Thacker Pass record of decision on that, with mine construction. But if that happened, they would be free to the permit application. BLM would be free to engage in tribal consultation and conclude that process. Tribal consultation about historic properties or sacred sites, consultation, the agency doesn't have to do what the tribes tell them to do. The agency just has to listen. Just has to say, okay, thanks for telling us your position. That's great. We don't want to do it. We're going to blow this place up. But they do have to afford the tribes that opportunity. They have to give the tribes an opportunity to try and convince the agency to redesign the project or do something to avoid historic properties. It's important to know that if a corporation is and their shareholders, because one way that the legal process can indirectly stop a project is if it just appears to shareholders that projects like these are going to be hung up in legal na-na land for years, where they're not going to see any return on their investment, and those shareholders start to pull their money out to the point that Lithium Nevada doesn't have the capital it needs to construct the mine. That could be a way that the mine is stopped, but that won't be because of a judge's order. It would just be because of the judge making them go back and redo things. It would take longer, and investors get impatient and they pull their money. It's just always important for people to remember what law is actually capable of in these kinds of campaigns, and it's a very limited tool for actually stopping these projects.
Thank you for that. It's good to hear that coming out of the mouth of a lawyer. Law is not the most powerful tool at our disposal. It's one tool among many. So for everyone watching, that's Will Falk. He's an attorney representing the Reno Sparks Indian Colony and the Summit Lake Paiute Tribe in a new lawsuit against the Thacker Pass lithium mine. He's also a co-founder of Protect Thacker Pass, along with myself, Max Wilbert. We had a protest camp set up on site at Thacker Pass from January 15th, 2021, the day that the permit was approved for the project, until about October, when we were forced to shut that camp down. The Bureau of Land Management is actually coming after Will and I right now, trying to fine us $49,890.13 for the crime of erecting a latrine on public lands for Native elders to use the bathroom while they were engaged at ceremony and coming up to Thacker Pass to pray and visit the site and talk with us and spend time on the land in this place that's so culturally important. We're not making that up. We had been going to the bathroom behind the sagebrush, as the saying goes, but we specifically got requests to build a latrine from elders who said, we can't do that. We're elderly. We can't go out there. We need a better bathroom situation up here. This is a remote area. And so we did that. We put that toilet together with the help of other people from the community. Basic latrine, composting toilet, you could call it. One of the most sustainable ways to deal with human waste, no long-term impact to the land. In fact, just provides fertilizer for the plants ultimately. And the BLM is coming after us for almost $50,000 in fine money because of that. This campaign has been going on for a long time now. It's going to continue. We need support to help this lawsuit continue, to get people out on the ground, keeping an eye on things, participating. This is a movement, and it's not going to be over just because a lawsuit has been filed. Even if that lawsuit is successful, it's not going to end there. This has to come with organizing, political organizing. We have to get together, work together, collaborate, and organize to protect this place. And it's going to take every one of us. This has been a movement that has been so incredible in bringing together different people. The amount of power, the amount of incredible people who have made sacrifices and done work in such a heartfelt way for this place is really incredible. So I know some of them are probably watching right now, and you know who you are. All of you folks who have been out to the protest camp when that was in place, who have donated, who have attended events and helped organize events, who have participated in the prayers, in the runs, the walks, in the rallies, who have spoken to media and helped spread the word. If you want to get involved, check out protectthackerpass.org. There's a link in the chat below. There's also a donate link there. So if folks want to support this work.
Next, let's jump to Vanessa Beeley on the AM Wake Up Show with Steve and Craig.
The negatives. So I grabbed a USA Today
nightmare, dude,
and a New York Times. So check out the article on the front page of not the front page, but the front section of the USA Today. It is under opinion, so I appreciate that. Syrians need relief from quakes and Assad. So they're still fucking pushing that narrative. And throughout the article, there's a whole stand up to Assad regime. So they're all on the same email list. They're all on the same message, just like Ned Price. We're not working with Assad. Even during an earthquake, he's going to be more brutal. He's still the number one problem, so much that we can manufacture consent to not help these poor people in the middle of an earthquake.
Well, I mean, it is kind of extraordinary what's going on. I mean, I think we touched on it last time, the fact that the West and Israel, as proven by the bombing on the 19th, so 3 days ago.
We do have
18th.
We have Vanessa's article in the doc. We could pull that up. It'll say Israel bomb.
Yeah, I mean, it was more of a scribble because I just needed to kind of get something. Plus, I was just feeling so angry. I mean, it was about 1 a.m. And bearing in mind that people here are, I can't describe how traumatized they are, actually. I mean, friends of mine are completely freaking out at the moment. Like the slightest noise, everyone's out. A friend of mine told me today, the next suburb to me where I used to live, the last 2 nights, everyone has stayed in their cars outside or in the parks or whatever, refusing to go back in their house because there have been multiple, not only aftershocks, but new earthquakes on different, what you call them, fault lines.
Yeah.
And then in the midst of all of this, so I think at that point we just had the 6.3 earthquake on the southern Turkish, Syrian, western Syrian coast. And at 1 a.m. I suddenly heard explosions. I was like, are you kidding me? Sort of jumped out to see the missiles flying overhead and the air defense intercepting. And it was one of the biggest attacks, actually, that Israel has carried out on civilian areas, residential areas. 5 civilians killed, about 15 minutes drive from here. I went there the day after and saw the burned out apartment block. 1 cardiologist, 1 pharmacist, 1 engineer, and 2 other civilians. Now, the claim is that they were hitting Iranian military. Well, the only Iranian building in this street is the cultural center. I mean, we have a Russian cultural center. We have an Iranian cultural center. It's a place where people go. In the Russian one, for example, they go to learn Russian. And there are cultural exchanges between Russian, Iranian universities and Syrian students and so on. That's what it is. It's a cultural center. It's not a military center. And then further, they hit Damascus Citadel, but they also hit the archaeological institute that contains countless historic documents that many of which were destroyed. It has some of the it's one of the few institutes that has real state-of-the-art equipment for archaeology studies, sort of 3D printer, all of that destroyed. The citadel itself was badly damaged. I put photos of that up on my Telegram. And they also hit a UNESCO heritage site in Sweden. So it's like, I mean, this is just the eugenics program, because this is the erasing of cultural history and identity, right? And this is what has been going on since 2011, when this war started against Syria. The destruction of areas like Palmyra, the desecration of ancient Christian burial sites, the theft. I mean, more than 1 million artifacts have been stolen from inside Syria by the terrorist groups. And goodness knows where they're being sold on the dark web to various traders worldwide, and they'll end up in the British Museum probably, and wherever else, right? Yeah. So, you know, for me, it became clear at that point that my suspicions that the West, rather than coming to the aid of Syrians, was seeing this as the perfect opportunity to ramp up its war effort to topple the Syrian government. And we can see, I mean, the fundraising that is going on for the CIA MI6 white helmets right now is off the scale. I never even saw it like that when they first started up, before people really understood who they were. There is millions, I mean, 85 million going in from USA. The UK has just upped its pledge to almost 5 million. It's been giving them 2.2 million anyway. Up until 2022, they'd already received, just from USA, 25.2 million in heavy machinery funding, $1 million. And so, you know, what the hell do 3,000 volunteers need this amount of money for? Of course, it's to the armed groups. It's buying weapons, it's buying equipment, it's enabling them to move forward. And then, of course, you have the reports that Assad is bombing areas in Idlib, even immediately after the earthquake. No, what happened is the armed groups were sending suicide drones towards civilian areas, military areas, and they were brought down by the Syrian air defense. As I mentioned before, ISIS, immediately after the earthquake broke out, what a coincidence, out of Raju prison to the north of Afrin under the control of Turkish intelligence. And ISIS carried out 2 absolutely like massacres to the east of Homs that nobody is even hearing about. There is not a single report in Western media on this. There's nothing, no kind of, oh dear, the terrorists are capitalizing on a humanitarian tragedy to renew their attacks against Syrian civilians. No, nothing. It's all about Assad bombing Idlib, which, by the way, is infested with Al-Qaeda, that is making efforts to advance on Syrian army positions using the earthquake as cover. I mean, it's just, and then, as if we didn't need more proof of what was going on, Israel carries out one of its most intense attacks in the last 5, even 10 years.
Well, and this is something that we were talking about before you got on, but I mean, even Wall Street Journal, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, they've all covered it. But headline, Israel bombs Damascus airport is what they said, or something like that. But I mean, they're just, you know, it's the framing of it too. Like, it's kind of justified. Hit terrorist group.
Yeah. It's the framing, Steve.
Actionable intelligence that, what was his name? Let's see. I have it here somewhere. Where we go? Oh yeah,
yeah, but the ISIS attacks haven't been covered.
Yeah. And no, but they'll say that Israel was justified in bombing Damascus because there may have been an Iranian that they didn't like.
The number 2. That's what they always say. It's always the number 2. They keep taking out the number 2.
And that's, but you know, that's perfectly well to report on. As long as it's framed that way, but that's the only time that you've seen it, you know, in Western media, other than shows like this where you're coming on to talk about it, or Robert Inlakash is, you know, talking to some people and they're writing an article about it, and that's it. And it's like us and T-Lab, Ryan, that talk about it here. Yeah, that's more or less it.
Yeah. Do you think that the amped up the war in Ukraine, or tried to get that situation started to pull away Russia's attention from Syria? Because I keep saying, like, what is going to happen? What's the only thing that's going to save Syria You know, and I thought when the Russians got a little bit more involved, there was a possibility we might see, you know, I don't even know what would look like a something positive or some sort of peace within Syria, because I don't know if Israel will ever stop bombing them. But do you think that they created or hyped up Ukraine this maybe as a more of a distraction? Did you hear me, or I think your internet was going in and out a little bit?
Are we fuzzy?
Yeah,
we could be. We could be. Are we here? Hi? I guess not. I don't know. We'll figure it out. We will.
Let me get some coffee real quick. You want more?
I'm good. Ty, if we could, let's go to let's go to the earthquake map. It's in the and just to kind of show you guys now, okay, because we have entertained a couple of times the notion that these may have had some help. And I will acknowledge that this particular region, especially where Syria and Turkey meet, are on the convergence of three separate major fault lines. So, for example, in 2021, this particular region on the year had 22,000 earthquakes that they registered above like a 2.5.
Wow.
On the year. So divided by 12, that's roughly,
you said 20,000?
How
many thousand?
22,000.
So divided by 12.
So I feel like a couple thousand a month. Something like it.
About 18.
Yeah, roughly.
Yeah. 1,800 a month.
As of now, we've got, and we can try bringing Vanessa back in. But as of now, they have over 3,000 earthquakes on the year, and we're in February. So definitely like tracking around the average, but they're usually not this major is what I've kind of been getting. And then Vanessa sent an article from the Mideast Eye about just how earthquake prone the area is. So without delving fully into tinfoil hattery, how likely do you think there is the assistance of a program like HARP on these earthquakes?
I was going to say, guess what my favorite instrument is? It's a harp. Sorry.
You can play a harp with the ball. Oh, okay. I saw that. I was confused.
I mean, the thing is, I think the regularity and the strength of the earthquake seems bizarre to me. And I mean, there was one today in Lebanon to the west of Beirut that was felt in the occupied territories in Palestine. And in Iran, actually. I can't remember the region. But there was a 5.5 in Iran. So I think for me, the thing that still stands out to me is kind of the 9 embassies closing down in Istanbul before the first earthquake hit. And also the speed with which the West has responded, not with humanitarian aid, as I said, but basically weaponizing the entire tragedy to basically start again. It's a bit like Groundhog Day. I think I told you I was talking to Corey about this, and both of us were kind of pretty depressed by it, that really we were just back to square one. All the work we've done for years, sort of pushing back against the narratives on Syria, suddenly we're just back to day one, and everyone's sort of, people are sharing white helmet PR and citing their dreadful statements instead of boycotting them. I mean, it's just extraordinary. That I don't know how else to put this into context. This group that claims to have saved 122,000 lives since they started operating alongside Al-Qaeda in Syria Turkey and Jordan since 2013. I can't find one single interview with one single family member of the so-called 122,000 victims they've saved or rescues they've done, praising them. Now they're going to produce them because they generally watch what I say about them and then come up with them. So now they're probably going to suddenly come up with all these interviews. Just as they did when I pointed out there were no women. Suddenly they ran a whole campaign about women in the white helmets.
They'll come up with some like grainy looking footage from 2015 that they'll say, yeah, I mean, in an era of deep fakes, they could do whatever the shit they want to do at this point.
They control the media. When you get independent journalists that get outside their bubble and can expose the truth, they'll go right to you, troll you, because you are standing on the truth.
Well, they'll put you on a kill list if you're good enough.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I think from various, let's say, Syrian analysts that I'm talking to here about what's going on, they're worried. I mean, most Syrians are focused on the earthquake itself. They're focused on the fact that they're heavily traumatized now. I mean, I don't know how many millions are now homeless again, having sort of survived one of the most barbaric economic sanction regimes that was sort of, that the ante was upped by Trump. And it certainly hasn't been sort of backed off on by Biden, who in reality from day one was bombing the only open trading channel between Iran, Iraq and Syria in Abu Kamal. And now you have a situation where honestly the majority of the population is heavily traumatized. I mean, we talked about it earlier, Steve. Young people are literally dying of heart attacks, and no, it's very unlikely it's the vaccine. The uptake here is, or was, way less than 6%. And certainly by some of the poorer regions that are being worst affected by the earthquake, it won't be anything to do with the vax, it's to do with overload of stress. You know, 11 years of war, economic sanctions, probably they've been bombed and attacked at some point, and now they're dealing with the earthquake. And of course, what is the Western media doing? It's also alarming. You know, it's raising the alarm on it instead of dealing with it in a practical, rational way. It's upping the ante while ignoring something like Ohio.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So as soon as you see that, you know that it's being weaponized, it's being exploited. And the West now, the US is asking for the opening of all the border crossings, Turkey into the northwest, into Idlib, controlled by Al-Qaeda. So we know why that is. So it'll just be a free rat run for weapons and God knows what, probably coming from Ukraine, amongst other places. And also the free flow of ISIS from Syria into Ukraine. You know, I mean, this is, and then also into Africa, because Africa is probably the next front line that we're going to see develop between, well, definitely Russia, but maybe even bring China into the mix.
Yeah, they're gearing
in Africa with the NATO base in Mauritania, and the fact that, of course, they're funding and arming and equipping various terrorist groups there, including Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, etc. And that, you know, that's a known fact that's been going on for quite a long time, to destabilize the countries where China is investing in infrastructure, roadways, industry, etc., to try and prevent it. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, in a way, I think I'm actually worried for the first time in the 11 years that I've been, or I haven't been reporting for 11 years, but the 7 years that I've been reporting, I actually feel concerned because the country itself right now it's just in such a fragile, vulnerable state. And we saw when Israel bombed, I mean, people just didn't know what to do anymore. I mean, it was like, what the hell else? You know, you're going to send a tsunami, you're going to, I mean, what else is on the cards for Syria? Because militarily, the West hasn't managed to destroy it completely. And you know, we know, one, the US, UK don't give up, particularly when the US has already managed to occupy territory. It doesn't leave. And plus, we know that, or rather we hope, that the Western-centric empire is kind of on its last legs. But that is the point at which it's most dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's backed into that corner.
Well, and I mean, the United States and the UK, or at least UK Intel and the Crown and the US government, have wanted to destabilize the European Union. They've wanted to make sure that there's never an economic partnership between Germany and Russia. They've wanted to make sure that there's enough chaos and destabilization in the regions that they don't already control, so that they can at least maintain some sort of like foothold for pillaging. But we're now with Putin's speech yesterday, with the looks like a formalizing of a military partnership between Russia and China, and a formation of the BRICS nations to the point to where they have their own central bank and have appointed their own BRICS central banker head of the BRICS central bank. It looks like we're kind of steamrolling into the only way to beat the monster is to be the monster. So now we have to make sure that we have the central bank and we have the digital ID and we have the biometric scanning, because otherwise the big bad West might get us. And it's I'm not seeing like I'm seeing a shift in punishment, but I'm not necessarily seeing a win out of the way that it's currently shaping up. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you know, you asked, I mean, I did like a Schiller Institute debate. Well, not debate, just one of their kind of roundtable panel discussions, I guess, last night on sanctions. And yeah, you know, for sure, the sanctions have been punishing Syria for decades, actually. I mean, but obviously they've been ramped up since 2016. But in all honesty, Syria could survive the sanctions, in my opinion, if the US gets the fuck out of Syria and stops stealing 80% of its oil. You know, if Syria had oil, we wouldn't have electricity problems, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I talk about this all the time, but the impact of US military occupation in Syria is huge. And it decimates the ability of the country to be self-sufficient despite sanctions. Look at Iran. Iran has been under heavy sanctions for a very long time. But when you go to Iran, everything is working. Right? Why? Because nobody's got their hands on the resources. Right? Yeah. Because since the Shah was kicked out, the Brits kind of lost their control over Iranian oil, and it became, you know, nationalized, basically. And so Iran is managing because it has its resources. Syria can manage if it has its resources. Yemen can manage if it has its resources. Yeah. You know, and it's no coincidence that whatever forces the US is using to destabilize a country, of course it's Saudi Arabia and UAE and Israel and Yemen, but of course, what did they occupy first? The resources. What did they occupy first in Syria? The electrical power grids, the water supply, and the oil resources, the hydrocarbon resources, and the food, the agricultural regions. And that continues until today. And so, you know, my argument is, yes, it's great to say that we should lift the sanctions, and I wholeheartedly agree with that, but we have to go further than that. And if we're talking about anti-war rallies, then we've got to start preempting the potential for a new war against Syria, because it's building up. Yeah. And Syria is not in a fit state right now to really defend itself. And I hate saying that. I don't want to say that. But
I mean, if you've been ravaged with earthquakes and you've had the shit bombed out of you and you've had your resources plundered for the better part of a decade, then you're not going to be in a fit. That's not the doomsday or like Debbie Downering or anything like it. It's a sober assessment of reality, and that just sucks.
Vanessa, can you provide a little context for me really quickly so I can understand completely what area are the United States bases, or where are they occupying in which they are stealing these resources? Remember, Trump, I said take the oil, we took the oil.
Yeah. Okay, if people look at a map of Syria, I don't know if you've got one on my Telegram channel.
We can get a.
I think we just had that earthquake map.
We got an earthquake map.
Yeah. But basically, if you look at the river Euphrates, which comes down from Turkey through the northern region of Syria, to the east of that, you have Deir ez-Zor, and then further to the east, it doesn't. If you look at Al-Hasaka, so you look at Al-Hasaka in the northeastern corner. If you imagine, they don't even put the river in.
No, I'm trying to get a decent topographical map.
Midpoint between Al-Hasaka and Raqqa. To the east of that is all American Kurdish Contra occupied. But then even coming down in the southeast on the border with Jordan, you have Al-Tanaf base and Al-Rukban refugee camp, which is under the control of Al-Tanaf base. And that has a 55-kilometer exclusion zone around it set up by the US, in which it basically trains armed groups, including ISIS, in the use of HIMARS, for example, which we know to have a fairly long range. They could certainly hit Damascus from there. And Rukban camp, which is bringing armed fighters in from Jordan and weapons in from Jordan.
So how many bases total do you think? You said 55 kilometer don't even go in their zone? So there's no way the Syrian army can get into these areas and take them down?
No. They'd be, not even Russia. Russia's not, I mean, you basically can't enter in there. And if you come anywhere near that exclusion zone, which is seen as a protection zone for ISIS, by the way. I mean, when ISIS flared a number of attacks, it goes into that protection zone because it knows the Syrian Arab army can't follow it in there. So number of bases, I'm trying to remember, I did actually write this up, but about 4 or 5 years ago, when I think there were at that point around 20. But when I'm talking bases, I'm not talking sort of huge areas. Tanaf is big. Al-Tanaf is probably the biggest one in Syria. Oh, cool. Yeah.
I think we got a little bit more in terms of.
So there you'll see at the bottom, sorry, I'm pointing at the screen. You've got Abu Kamal, Al-Bu Kamal, which is on the right-hand side there. That's the area that Biden has bombed and Israel has regularly bombed because Iran basically, on one count, Iran was sending oil to Lebanon that is also energy deprived through Iraq and then through Syria. So it'll use the Al-Bu Kamal crossing.
What's very just east of Abu Kamal there?
What's east? Iraq.
Okay. What major city there? I mean, are they? And we have Iraq bases all over the place. That's why we're.
Yeah. But I mean, basically, Al-Bu Kamal is the only crossing that isn't effectively under the control of the United States, right? So the US is exiting Syria via all the other crossings with stolen oil, stolen wheat, stolen barley. And even if it's the Kurds that are bringing materials out, they have usually an air protection and air convoy protection from the US. But if you go down a bit from Al-Bu Kamal, you'll see Al-Tanaf,
yes,
which is to kind of to the direct east of Damascus. That's on the border with Jordan. And then just below Al-Tanaf, to the south of Al-Tanaf, you don't see it on there, is the Rukban refugee camp. So that entire area of Al-Tanaf has the 55-kilometer exclusion zone. And then if you go down, can you see Suwayda? They spell it Suwayda.
Right there. This is all very close to Damascus. That's why I'm so surprised.
I mean, it's all, the U.S.'s whole occupation zone is basically right outside.
Wow.
And it's,
but if you look at the map of Syria as a whole, like basically all of the northern border is controlled by the U.S., Turkey, and Al-Qaeda.
Yes.
Right. So that entire kind of northern swathe, and the only entrance, as I said, is Al Bukamal. But then if you come down to the southeast, you've got Al Tanf, and from Al Tanf, ISIS attacked Suwayda. I don't know if you remember, I wrote about that in 2018 when more than 200 civilians were killed in an ISIS attack. And basically when they finished the attack and it was failed, they fled towards Al Tanf. So they were then given protection by the Americans. And the very fact that ISIS could move from Al Tanf to Suwayda across what is effectively volcanic desert. So it's completely open. They can be very easily seen. But the attack itself, I think at that point, actually, I'm just thinking, came from Yarmouk basin to the south of Damascus. And ISIS were basically trying to take control of that area in Suwayda because it was high ground and full of caves and areas where they could have hidden themselves and set up a new military operation there. But, everything that ISIS is doing is being done with the protection and the empowerment of the United States alliance, including the UK. And if you come up from Damascus on the main arterial road to Homs, so then go to the east of Homs towards Palmyra, and basically that's where the ISIS attacks have been taking place.
Next, we will look at a clip from the Corbett Report, where James shows an episode from 2015 about Ukraine and Russia and how it relates today.
Welcome back to the Corbett Report. Welcome back. I'm James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and if I've done my math correctly, today should be the 18th of February 2023 in the United States, at least when I post this video. And if it is, then that is an important date, because tomorrow will be the date that all the Corbett reporters in the US, and anyone else who can make it, will be flocking to Washington for the Rage Against the War Machine event. Right? And if you don't know about the Rage Against the War Machine event, of course you can listen to my recent conversation with Nicholas Brana and Angela McArdle on Solutions Watch about Rage Against the War Machine, or you could go directly to rageagainstwar.com, where you can find more information about that rally, what is happening, who is speaking, why you should be out there in the first place. But hopefully my audience understands why it is important to be resisting the NATO war machine, I would assume, by this point. But I thought it would be particularly appropriate to arm my listeners, my peaceful listeners, with the most important ammunition in the InfoWar: knowledge, facts, information. And on that note, of course, this flashback that we're going to watch today is incredibly appropriate. It is a conversation that I conducted in 2015 with Rick Rozoff, then of Stop NATO International. And if you don't know about Rick Rozoff, you could start by, of course, typing Rozoff into the search bar on CorbettReport.com, and you'll see some of the many, many conversations that we had back at that time when I believe he was more active and Stop NATO International was still functioning. I believe Stop NATO International itself has been discontinued, but Rick Rozoff is continuing to at least follow the information and news about NATO on seemingly a daily basis at his new blog, Antebellum, which I will be linking up in the show notes, so you can go check that out. It seems like a very, very thorough keeping up to date of all of the latest information about NATO and its activities. Rick Rozoff also has a literary selections blog, For Peace Against War, which is a collection of anti-war writings, poetry and prose and others, sometimes going back thousands of years. A very, very interesting blog that I will draw your attention to. Again, I will link that up in the show notes. It's at rickrozoff.wordpress.com. But back in 2015, obviously in the wake of Crimea and the coup that had taken place in Ukraine and all of that rigmarole, Rick Rozoff was on the Corbett Report to boldly predict that Ukraine war is inevitable. Well, sadly, he was exactly right with that prediction. Maybe it didn't take the most accurate crystal ball to be able to see that, but at any rate, Rick Rozoff was talking about it, was warning about it at the time. And as you will listen in this conversation, it is not a happy and optimistic conversation, but as Rick Rozoff says, it's better to know the uncomfortable truth than to be told a comfortable lie. So it's a very deep conversation. I think you'll get a lot out of it, even if you have been following what's been going on in the Ukraine for the last several years. I think this is a good history lesson because it makes a point which I was attempting to articulate back at the start of this current round of military interventionism back last year when I wrote my Ukraine Crisis What You Need to Know article. The clock didn't start in February of 2022. The clock didn't even start in 2014. It didn't start in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And the clock has been running for many, many, many hundreds of years. And there's a lot of water under the bridge between Ukraine and Russia and the various permutations, geographical and political and otherwise, that it has taken over the years. So there's a lot to take into consideration. But at any rate, this will get you up to speed on what was going on in that time frame in 2015 and why it was obvious at that time that NATO was going to continue to push this until some sort of military response came from the Russian side. All of that is to say that I am thoroughly anti-war, and I am not on board with yay, Putin standing up to NATO, yay, roll in the tanks, let's kill people. That's going to be the answer to this. It certainly isn't. Even strategically, even from a strategic point of view, it is quite stupid on Putin's part because it absolutely is the big shot in the arm that NATO needed and is using to start constructing an even larger empire. If you want more details on, but what could Putin have possibly done other than roll in the tanks and start invading? Well, there's a conversation that I will direct your attention to very recently between Rage Against the War Machine speaker Scott Horton and Rage Against the War Machine speaker David Swanson on Scott Horton's podcast recently on what Russia could have done instead of invading Ukraine, which I did post in my subscriber newsletter a few weeks ago, so I hope you're familiar with that conversation. But they make some very good points in there that military intervention was certainly not the only option, and definitely not the best option. Anyway, that being said, that's just the context for this conversation that is obviously extremely relevant. And I want to give the hat tip to Corbett Report member Chatters, who left a comment on this post a couple of weeks ago to say, fascinating to review this again now. And you're exactly right, Chatters. And thank you for bringing this particular conversation to my attention, because after having done this work for 16 years now, there's all sorts of gems like this in the archives that I don't even remember exist. So sometimes I need people to remind me what exists in my own archives. So thank you, Chatters, for that. And Brock West, video editor extraordinaire, has visualized this for your viewing pleasure. But right now, let's get straight into it. My conversation from 2015 with Rick Rozoff on why Ukraine war with NATO and against Russia is inevitable. Welcome, friends. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. Today is the 12th of February, 2015, across the date line here in Japan. Still the 11th of February back in the United States, where I am very happy to be joined on the line once again by our old friend Rick Rozoff of Stop NATO International at rickrozoff.wordpress.com. Someone who I hope you will already be familiar with, and if not, please check out the Stop NATO website, and also please check out our previous conversations. He is a wealth of knowledge geopolitically, and he is a powerful voice in the anti-war movement. So Rick Rozoff, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you once again, James, for having me. I think there's no more vital time or issue, a time to be discussing it, or a vital issue than the Ukrainian crisis and all it portends for global developments.
Well, Rick Rozoff, we are right in the middle of a news cycle right now that involves such developing stories as the ongoing attempts to negotiate a ceasefire between the Ukraine and the internal Ukrainian opposition, between the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, that's ongoing right now in Belarus. And so there will be some results from that probably by the time most people are catching this conversation. We've also seen other developments that have a role to play in what's happening right now. For example, on the front page of Stop NATO International right now, you have U.S. Congress readies $1 billion for war in Ukraine. Also, U.S. deploys more warplanes in expanding anti-Russian campaign. We have some other interesting things making headlines, like the recent telephone call between Obama and Putin that occurred on Tuesday, in which Obama apparently warned Putin that there will be consequences if Putin does not grasp the opportunity for diplomatic resolution of this Ukrainian crisis this week. And of course, we also have the downright absurd, like the recently released Pentagon report stating that Putin actually has Asperger's. No word yet on what particular mental ailments Obama has, but I think we can all speculate. But in this mix of ongoing events, there is obviously a lot to bite off and chew, and as I say, a lot of this will be decided in the time between the time we record this and the time this interview is released. So let's set the scope and the parameter for what's actually happening right now in the context of this ongoing NATO aggression against Russia and bumping up against Russia. How did this eventuate, and what are the things that people need to know that they probably do not about the way this conflict is taking shape?
This month marks a year exactly, the anniversary of the overthrow of the however, unlikable in other respects, nevertheless, legally elected and internationally recognized government of then President Viktor Yanukovych. It was in February of 2014, of course, that with the active connivance with the United States, and not only so-called non-governmental organizations, what I prefer to refer to as NNGOs, non-governmental organizations, that is front groups of the U.S. State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, not only were they working avidly, overtime, but the likes of John McCain, who now again is in charge of international affairs and other chief committees in the Senate, with his Republican Party having regained control of that House of the U.S. Congress, and of course the infamous Victoria Nuland, State Department's Undersecretary of State for European Eurasian Affairs, mingling amongst the protesters in Maidan Square in the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, handing out pastries and probably dollars and cell phones. I mean, who knows what was distributed through the U.S. Embassy and through the good offices of Jeffrey Pyatt, who was clearly the coup meister, if you will, the master of the coup d'etat that occurred a year ago. So, that by way of background. Immediately thereafter, the very man that in the intercepted or leaked a phone conversation with Victoria Nuland to Jeffrey Pyatt, wherein she used an obscenity in reference to the European Union, which, as I've stated repeatedly, is the least offensive part of that conversation. Handpicked the composition of a post-coup Ukrainian junta, mentioning particularly that Arseny Yatsenyuk would be head of government, which he is. He's prime minister and has been in the interim. So that what almost immediately succeeded that was the launching of a full-fledged war. And I know a lot of people like to pull punches or like to make abstract or abstruse commentary on issues as though, they're writing for the history books. That's not the sort of person I am. And I have no desire to, promote my own sagacity, by speaking about abstract issues. The long and short of it is, starting on April the 15th of last year, the U.S. and NATO-supported puppet regime in Kiev, that of Petro Poroshenko, launched a series of military campaign, in fact, a war, which they referred to as an anti-terrorist operation, ATO, in the eastern part of the country, particularly in the Donbass region. It is now, as of today, 302 days old. That is, we're coming up on another anniversary, almost a year, of war in Europe. And the world has done a remarkable job, a despicable but a remarkable job at ignoring this, or to the extent it's paid any attention at all to downplay the significance of it. Today, for example, English language Ukrainian government press agents and organs, have announced rather routinely that yesterday in the Donbass region, 19 Ukrainian government soldiers were killed, 78 wounded. That is almost 100 casualties in one day. So the fighting in the east has reached an unprecedented level of intensity and fatality. And it's clear it cannot go on like this much longer before somebody intervening, and I mean intervening militarily.
What is your take then on the ongoing negotiations for a ceasefire? Do you believe this is a delaying tactic? Is there an actual attempt being made to come to some sort of resolution here?
It is the most cynical of charades, and the fact that the Russian president would participate in them while his own country has a war on its border, to go through this, pretense of anything being resolved is a black mark against him, in my estimate. I don't know why he's humoring the likes, to shake hands with a murderer like Petroshenko, for the head of state of a legitimate country is a not only condescending, it's cheapening the role of the Russian government and the president of the country, in my estimate, to have any dealings with Poroshenko whatsoever.
Well, this obviously raises the greater question of NATO versus Russian military tensions and the sort of greater context of this. Is there some sense in which this is the flashpoint for that conflict to occur? Do you expect that this is going to result in some sort of outright military aggression, or is this a proxy war that's being fought right now?
It's a one-sided war. I mean, I'll be perfectly blunt and candid about this. It is a one-sided war being waged by the U.S. and NATO surrogate forces in Kiev, which, again, as I mentioned, have been fighting a war against its own people, the people of Ukraine, or the eastern Ukraine, for 302 days. This war has not only been, in some cases, as in Donetsk and Lugansk, maybe a score of miles from the Russian border. In many cases, the war is waging right on the Russian border and across into Russian territory. There have been incidents where the Ukrainian government military forces have shelled targets inside Russia, killed at least one Russian civilian, have attacked and destroyed Russian checkpoints and so forth with complete impunity. With complete impunity. That is, while the U.S. and NATO, and today's news is, I hope you get this on the air as soon as possible, is that the commander of U.S. Army Europe, General Benjamin Hodges, who was in Kiev a couple of weeks ago, at which point he supposedly was distributing medals to not only Ukrainian government forces, but to the likes of the Pravy sector, that is the right sector-led Azov battalion of neo-fascist militia, and bestowing medals on them. He is quoted today as saying the U.S. is prepared to supply military weaponry to exactly the fighting forces in eastern Donbass, that is exactly to the aggressors in eastern Ukraine, and that, with the naked participation, the fact that the U.S. and NATO have entered this war as co-belligerents, by supplying military forces, by training Ukrainian government forces and so forth, and that there seems to be no countermeasures taken by Russia is a signal to me of something extremely dangerous going on, which is to say that, had it reached a military stalemate, and had Russia let it be known that certain steps would not be tolerated, I'm certain this catastrophe would never have reached the dimensions it has. It's the very fact that Russia has permitted the U.S. and NATO to act precisely as they've chosen to in Ukraine that has led to this crisis right now, which I am convinced is irreversible. And I am convinced that the side that is going to intervene militarily at this point is the United States and NATO, and you can count on it happening in the near future.
Well, absolutely all of the signs are tending in that direction, but that's an intriguing analysis because it seems to... Are you asserting Russian complicity in what's happening?
Complicity or capitulation, you take your choice.
Once again, I think one of the most interesting and worrying parts of this, of course, is what's happening right now to the Ukrainian people, and you have posted up as the top story as we speak on Stop NATO at rickrozoff.wordpress.com. Ukrainian junta ready to declare martial law in 302-day war. Just another inevitable sign of the erosion of any idea of civil society in Ukraine as a result of this aggression that's being waged right now. Tell us about this and how this is going to affect the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, I invite people to read the English language Ukrainian government or pro-government websites like Interfax Ukraine, Ukrinform, Union, National Radio Company of Ukraine. These are all available in English. It's not a matter of speculating about what the regime is doing. They're quite open about it. Today, Union, it's an acronym, one of the major pro-government, if not government, media sources announced again, it had been mentioned or bruited a couple of days ago, that Poroshenko has stated quite openly that if the fighting continues in the eastern part of the country, in the Donbas region, he is prepared to institute martial law throughout the country, the entirety of the country, not just the affected areas. Similarly, this is the second time he's made a statement to this effect in the last 72 hours or so. Similarly, a story in that same source, Union mentioned a couple of days ago that the Ukrainian government is prepared to register for military purposes, perhaps conscript all women between the ages of 20 and 50. So what you're looking at is something quite martial law, universal conscription, that's placing the entire country on a war footing. And it suggests that, contrary to the assertions by the government, they're conducting a so-called anti-terrorist operation in the East. In fact, they're engaged in full-fledged civil war.
Very disturbing indeed, although not surprising, as you say, to the people who are keeping their eye on the situation. So what is the actual game plan here? The Ukraine is being targeted, and presumably for a reason. It was not picked randomly. What is NATO and the IMF and the EU and the other people with a stake in this conflict actually engaged in doing here?
Those of us, Cassandras like ourselves, James, let's be honest about it, who constantly warn about certain events or see tendencies or trends emerging and try to point them out to people, oftentimes with, very little response. I wrote an article 5 years ago suggesting the so-called Eastern Partnership Initiative of the European Union, and it was launched 6 years ago on the initiative primarily of Sweden and Poland more than Sweden even. The foreign ministers of which at that time were the former U.S. resident and, no doubt U.S. operative Radek Sikorski, who was foreign minister of Poland. He's now chief of their parliament. He was formerly defense minister. He is, mooted to become head of state at some point, prime minister if not president, head of government, head of state. And Carl Bildt in Sweden, the foreign minister, who is a notorious Russophobe and a virulent NATO advocate. I don't know how many people in the world realize that, how many people in Sweden realize that. But they crafted a program called Eastern Partnership, which aimed at the economic and the military and the political and the ideological integration of those remaining former Soviet republics outside of Central Asia, excluding, of course, Russia. And they are, in fact, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And the plan was to wean them away from former, how would I put it, autonomous alliances or organizations in former Soviet space, like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is as close to a military bloc as exists within the former Soviet Union. Belarus and Armenia are members of that group, and they're targeted by the Eastern Partnership. And all 6 countries, excluding Georgia, as of immediately after the Six-Day War with Russia in August of 2008, are members of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is the closest equivalent, say, to the European Union that exists within the former Soviet Union. And that, my article 5 years ago suggested, because I thought it was transparently obvious, that this was part of a plan to wean the other former Soviet republics away from Russia, to destroy any, post-Soviet formations, and to recruit all non-Russian former Soviet republics into the European Union and into NATO, at least excluding the 5 Central Asian republics, as they're not within the geographical purview of either the European Union or NATO, but, in some other capacity through partnership programs. And having warned about that, when last November, the crisis in Ukraine erupted, and erupted precisely because an association agreement, capital A's in both instances, between the European Union and Ukraine under the auspices of the Eastern Partnership had simply been deferred by the Yanukovych government, which immediately gave rise to, the sort of color revolution scenario we're all too familiar with, where, swarms or, rent-a-mobs, whatever we want to call them, of young people who seem to have nothing else to do. They have no jobs, they don't go to school, but they seem to be, with all the latest telecommunication devices at their disposal, are out in Maidan Square trying to restage the Orange Revolution activities of the year 2004. And one thing led to another, as we know. And again, a year ago, the internationally recognized government is overthrown in a violent uprising. The interim government stipulated and essentially appointed by the U.S. State Department took power, and shortly thereafter, as we've talked about, launched military operations against its own citizens in the east of the country. I mean, that was what we have to know. But we have to know that this, as you're indicating, this was a long-planned objective of pulling Ukraine complete. I can't even say out of the Russian orbit. It had never been in the Russian orbit. I mean, Ukraine had never been a member of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, for example. It had a 1,500-mile border with Russia and wasn't even a member of a post-Soviet security arrangement. It had been a member of several NATO initiatives, including permanent military deployments in the Indian Ocean and in the Mediterranean Sea.
You're speaking militarily, though. You're not suggesting that Ukraine was never in the economic orbit of Russia.
Very little. I mean, it was a member of the Commonwealth of Independent States, as were the 12 former Soviet republics, excluding the 3 Baltic states. So, in that sense, it's a fairly loose affiliation. Of course, it will leave the Commonwealth of Independent States. Now, so the objective I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the description of the Eastern Partnership has been achieved. That Ukraine has been wrenched out of any, economic or political affiliations, organizations with which Russia is also a member. That's been accomplished. I should mention an opposition member of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament in Ukraine. There's a video making the rounds now from Oleg Zarnov, where he talked last autumn, I think in October, November at the very latest, saying that the West, the U.S. and NATO, plans to overthrow the government in Ukraine and institute a civil war in the country. Now, that is not a wild guess. I think he had his ear pretty close to the ground. He understood what the plan was, and indeed, precisely that has ensued.
Well, you paint a very vivid and persuasive picture of the geopolitical machinations and the military aggression that has led us to this point, but the question obviously becomes, how do we actually effectively oppose this militarization, this military aggression, and support the people of Ukraine without giving into the logic which would say that what we need is Russian military to be the anti-aggressors, and then, just supporting the war machine itself, which obviously relies on opposition, military opposition to keep perpetuating itself. How do we actually insert ourselves in a fruitful way to stop this militarization?
I wish I had a handy prescription for that, and if I did, I think it would be outdated the very moment I enunciated it. That is to say, that events are moving at such a rapid pace, they appear to be so irreversible. We have to keep in mind that we now have a airtight, hermetically sealed political system in the United States, particularly as it affects foreign policy issues, where there is absolute unanimity, or almost such, in both houses of the U.S. Congress. 535 representatives in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. You can count on them voting unanimously to support any act of military aggression internationally, particularly against Russia. We've seen the Democratic Progressive Caucus, for example, vote to a person for the recent legislation that was basically a declaration of war against Russia to be, filed away in one's jacket pocket, for use as needed. So that we're not, the decades old and unfortunately no longer operative, remedies like writing or calling your congressman, I think can be safely dismissed at this point. Hoping, as certain people, whether with good intentions or otherwise, including many in the Kremlin, that the Ukrainian crisis would create a fissure between the U.S. and its European allies is transparently not materialized, and I would argue could not and will not be. There will never be such open divisions until the NATO is disestablished, is abolished. And I might add, people who are enthusiastic about the recent change in the Greek government might look at the fact that government has pledged fealty to both the European Union and NATO.
That's very true. And again, it leaves us in a position of being able to do almost nothing whatsoever, except watch as horrified onlookers as this continues, which is a very bleak way to end this conversation.
you're better the bitter truth than narcotizing people with pleasant illusions. Truthfully, and I think if nothing else, we may not be able to inspire people to go out and do heaven knows what right now, but we may be able to, very seriously instill in people the gravity of the situation we're confronting right now. I can't think of anything more grave. I don't want to raise this, but I certainly know that even the likes of people not given to inflammatory and certainly not to anti-Western rhetoric like Mikhail Gorbachev has more than once raised the specter of the possibility of nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine.
Rick Rosoff, I thank you for your time, and I look forward to...
Last but not least, let's go to a clip from Grand Theft World with Tony Myers talking with Maddie Bannon, Scott Armstrong, Courtney Turner discussing Maddie's article on the Last American Vagabond Substack.
I want to bring in Maddie Bannon. So, Maddie, are you here with us? Can you hear us all right?
Hey, guys. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. I know you just had your most recent article published. Was it at the T-Lab Substack? Which Substack is that at?
Last American Vagabond Substack.
Very good. Very good. Well, I'm very excited about this. I'm going to bring this up. And why don't you give people a little bit of who you are, your background, and your interest in, because you did the COVID collaborative series, and now you sort of transitioned to what happened with SBF and FTX. So what was sort of your interest in pivoting from that series to getting into this?
Well, two things. So COVID it's kind of been over for a little bit, out of the kind of the zeitgeist, I guess, if you want to use a Hegelian term, of the nation. So it's been a little bit. I thought I could take a break. I thought I could take a pause. So I did, and then I took pretty big interest in Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX because he seemed to espouse some pretty weird philosophy, and that's what I studied in school. So I took a look at it, and it just I was surprised that people of in his echelon of society are interested in philosophies that seem kind of dubious and debunked, and already found a series of refutations in their existences over the past 100, 200 years. So I thought that was interesting. So I kind of looked into it, and man, there's a lot there.
And let's, just for context, you studied philosophy, if I remember correctly. That's sort of your undergraduate. And so you have sort of a intimate sort of understanding of the philosophical world, the terminology, the language used there, and sort of, I guess, found an interesting thread that a lot of very powerful people have adopted as far as an ethical philosophy called effective altruism. And before we get into break that down, was it something that surprised you? Was that sort of the inclination for you to latch onto? And because I've never seen really obviously Rich and I talked about it on the show, but I've never seen anyone sort of do a deep dive into what is this philosophy? What are the precursors to this philosophy? What are the different sort of ideas around the concept of altruism and ethics and moral studies? And was that sort of your hook into this sort of subject in regards to, because there's been so much commentary, played a ton on the show about SBF and FTX and the FTX scandal, but no, I've not seen really anyone do a deep dive into what was the motivating factor. Ethics is the branch of philosophy that studies sort of human action and sort of ascribes like moral value to that. And so this is the branch of philosophy, as Leonard Peikoff and many others have noted, that has been the most actionable and substantial in history. This is what gives a justification for men and women to act in a certain way throughout different eras and epochs of our culture and different philosophies and within that context. So when you saw that, was that sort of something, because I think it sort of went across people's heads. They didn't see that. They're like, wait, okay, there's this thing called effective altruism, long-termism. I've heard different terms for it, but no one really expounded upon that yet. You were able to pick up that thread and write this unbelievably brilliant article that just shocked the hell out of me in regards to how deep you're able to take it from its sort of inception and some of the unscrupulous players that Rich and I have talked about, such as Jeremy Bentham, and a host of other individuals, Auguste Comte, who we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, the founder of positivism, A.J. Iyer, logical positivism, their association with the new scientism movement. So yeah, when you saw that, what was your first take in regards to effective altruism and this, Will McCaskill and Peter Singer and these guys talking about this term that it's as though it's just come out of nowhere and there's some moral arbiters of modern philosophy coming out of Oxford and setting up these foundations and all this nonsense?
Yeah, well, that was really it. So I took a class in university about John Stuart Mill and Auguste Comte and Oscar Wilde. So that's where I first found altruism. So when I heard altruism, I immediately thought of Auguste Comte and the positivist philosophy and his religion of humanity. So I was very interested in hearing that was part of the powerful's ethics. So when I looked into it, it did turn out to be along the lines of altruism, but kind of like altruism plus. What was interesting about it and what kind of made it stick together for me was that positivism is like scientism. It's what Auguste Comte was trying to do is create a scientific utopia where the hardest and most serious questions of our time are answered by basically a clergy of isolated scientists who would dictate and provide dogma for the rest of society to follow. So along the lines of our modern culture, which is very much the plebeians ruled by the scientism and scientific masters, and it is sort of religious in a sense. That caught me instantly, so I decided to look into it. And man, it's the exact same thing, except these people are able to tell you with their science and their calculations and their formulas and stuff like that what it is to be good, and what it is to be good turns out to be just to make a ton of money and then to give that away to whoever they think that you should give it to.
That's fascinating. Scott or Courtney, if you guys have any questions.
Yeah, I definitely want to jump in on this, and I just can't stress enough how awesome of a job you did, Maddie. And so she reached out to me. We started working together as far as the TLAB Substack with her COVID collaborator series, which is fantastic. Definitely lots of good information there. If you guys haven't checked that out, definitely a good callback. Go check that out. But, so I've been talking to Maddie back and forth. She's like, all right, I'm working on this article. She's like, I need a couple more weeks. And I'm like, okay, all right. And then she hit me up last week and she's like, all right, it's at about 10,000 words. And, I'm like, okay, all right. Yeah, this is going to be awesome. So I knew it was going to be epic. Right. And so I kind of had like a surface level understanding of the whole FTX situation. And so, you do a great job of breaking down the situation in a way that, you're like, the 12 steps or the 13 steps of like how it all fell apart for him. Right. So it's a great succinct analysis of the situation itself. And then just takes a hard turn into this idea, like all the background information around like utilitarianism. Like, these are all new concepts to me too. So, I learned so much. And then once you got to the effective altruism part, now I'm just like, okay, now this makes so much sense. And to me, it's like, like a form of just complete psychopathy. And it's like, it makes sense that this is like their guiding, this is like their North Star. Like this is what drives them. And they think they're doing like what's best, but it's just so diabolical. And so like, I definitely want to encourage everybody to go check it out. It's at tlavagabond.substack.com is where you read the full article. It's the main one pinned to the top of the main page there. But really just, I don't know how much you want to get into it, but like really what really stood out for me was that debate that I think it was the McCaskill guy had, right?
Yes, right? Where he wants to, he choose to say up.
Yeah, tell us about this whole story about the Picasso painting. Like,
sure.
Hell, and that kind of encapsulates this whole ideology.
Yes, it does. Will McCaskill is in a debate hosted by Intelligence Squared with a guy named Giles Fraser, who is he's a member of a church, also a philosopher. Basically, he's acting as the adversary in the debate, right? But he also refers to McCaskill as a saint multiple times. He praises him, and he's like, I hate arguing with you because I love you. But anyway, so he's like, this is my problem with effective altruism.
What a debate. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, right. So he asks, he poses this scenario. So there's a burning building, and there are two rooms in the burning building, and you can either say one thing in one room or the other thing in the other room. And one thing in one room is a child who's going to burn to death if you don't save them. The other thing is a Picasso, which will also burn if you don't save it. And he's like, well, effective altruism would say, or an effective altruist would say, or you could argue, that saving the Picasso would be best because you can save the Picasso and sell it for millions of dollars and then use those millions of dollars to send to, like, say, a malaria charity or something, which would effectively save hundreds or maybe 1,000 lives. And he's like, so the moderator asks, well, what would you do? And he says, well, yeah, I would actually save the Picasso. I'd let the child or whatever burn to death, because effectively there are 1,000 or, hundreds or 1,000 other kids or people in that burning building, represented by the Picasso. What I thought would be a better question to McCaskill is, what if it was your kid, or what if it was your mother, or what if it was even just a neighbor, somebody you've met multiple times? What if you could hear the person screaming or crying? I don't think that it's possible for somebody, at least not a sociopath, to not go in and save the person who you can hear is suffering and and burning to death. That just seems insane.
Yeah,
that's really what they would have you do.
Yeah, it's completely insane. And so how does that ideology, effective altruism, how does that apply to like the FTX situation? Like how did he get caught up in that? Like where's the overlap there?
Well, the origin story of their partnership. Is that what you're asking about?
Well, it's more like, how did his worldview of effective altruism lead to the collapse of FTX?
Oh, sure. Yeah, well, I mean, there's two possible scenarios. So either he was a true believer in effective altruism, like he said, and he believed that the world's on fire, essentially. Either he does something or the powerful people of the world do something about it and save the world. Or he, as a person of power and of a lot of money, he essentially is to blame for it not being saved. So what does he do? He founds a bunch of money-making machines, Alameda Research and FTX, which Alameda Research basically just makes money on money, trading, and making bets and stuff like that. And FTX basically is the same thing. It makes money on money by facilitating trades. So he makes a couple of money machines. They make a couple bad bets, which puts them at risk for their businesses not being solvent or even capable of making money anymore. So what does he do is he breaks the promise to his customers. He uses their money to fill gaps in the holes of Alameda Research's bad bets, where they need money, and they also need collateral for loans to make more bets. The justification for that is because he signed the Bill and Melinda Gates Giving Pledge to give like 90 to 99% of his money away before he dies, or give it away in a trust for other people to do the same thing. So he thought, with a company worth $32 billion at one point, at least that's what FTX was at its peak, he thought he could pretty much single-handedly save the world, or at least that's what he said. That's the story he was telling. So what did he do is, his companies were failing or on the risk of failing. So he just, broke a little promise. He just borrowed like $10 to $14 billion of money from people to keep his businesses afloat, so that he could go on to save the world. Because if his businesses went bankrupt, then there would be no saving of the world or saving humanity.
Yeah,
so that scheme awesome. makes sense.
That's awesome. And I want to just point everybody just to go read the article, because she goes into a lot of in depth into this, and so I had questions to expound upon on some things that aren't in the article, but some of the things these are new concepts to me, and like we have some of the most brilliant philosophical minds here between Courtney, Tony, and Maddie here. So it's like the idea of like utilitarianism is very interesting. It's the idea of like, from my understanding and what you described in the article, it's like almost assigning like a unit of measurement to like pleasure and pain. And it's like, right. Am I like in the right area where it's like you have like, 10 unit points of pleasure, but you have 9 unit points of pain. And so, that's a good thing, even though it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's almost like you look at it in such a I don't know, like a robotic, like it removes all the humanity out of things, Yeah. It's just so disturbing.
It
so
very
I'm kind of
much
curious.
removes
Yeah.
humanity.
What are your guys' thoughts?
It very much, I feel like it's in a lot of ways, it's a way of justifying, as you pointed out, psychopathy. It's a way, and they do it by arguing the ends justify the means. And this is very much a take on utilitarianism. And I think it's kind of utilitarianism, only it's been specifically stratified for, philanthropy. That's just essentially, how I would classify it. It's a philosophy that's geared towards justifying the philanthropists, which, philanthropists you think they're doing charity and the generous works, but often what are they really doing? They're giving large sums of money to their causes as a means of creating shells that exempt them from things like paying taxes and grant them all sorts of powers and privileges that the rest of the plebeians aren't, don't have.
And they can then
to.
invest the money into whatever they want. And,
Yep.
and that's, you see that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation being the most famous, obviously, with regards
Yep.
to COVID. And so, and they're adopting it.
And then they get to make themselves feel really good about it,
That's
because
the
they're being
smoke screen.
altruistic.
Exactly.
And they also make the public feel very good about
Yes.
them being so
Right.
wealthy and also directing the events and interests of the world.
Thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Independent Review. See you next week.